It's a movie that's about 35 years old now, and some of you may have seen. It starred John Candy and Martin. It was Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And the story is that they are both not connected, but they're trying to get trying to get home. And the weather has made it difficult, and they start out on airplanes, but airplanes close, and then they're on a train, and then the train derails, and then they have to get on a car, and they're in a bus. And early in the movie, there is a scene where they've already gotten on each other's nerves almost from the get-go. They're having to share this hotel room, and they kind of spring up. You know, he comes out of the bathroom, Steve Martin does, and he just essentially dresses down John Candy. He points out just every single thing that he's done wrong. They've been together for like a day, and he's already telling him every single thing that he has done wrong. Have you ever had a time where you felt like you just kind of wanted to point out all the wrongs of somebody else, right? It's like, and another thing, right? It feels like, and another thing would be a great one to be able to say. Like, here's this as well. Well, tonight, we are going to see an example of someone dressing down another group. Tonight and next week, we are going to be in Matthew chapter 23 primarily. And this is Jesus speaking unfiltered for an entire chapter about every single thing that the scribes and the Pharisees especially, but scribes and the Pharisees, he speaks for 38 verses, I believe it is, 39 verses, that Jesus essentially points out every single thing that they have done wrong. And it's almost like, because we've talked about this before, Jesus has spent 3 years preaching and teaching and sort of being bucked up against or knocked back by the Pharisees. And it's almost as if we can see Jesus saying, I'm just going to tell it all exactly like it is. If you look at Matthew chapter 23, outside of the first verse, every single letter in that chapter is red. Okay? And if there's a way to make it a bold red, I feel like it probably should have been that as well. And we're going to see that tonight and next week. Now, tonight we're going to look a little bit at why Jesus will condemn the Pharisees. And next week, we'll look a little bit more at the actual woes, the 7 or 8 woes that Jesus presents to them. So tonight, though, we're going to be talking about why this took place. Let's start, though, with a little bit of a recap of some things that we have been talking about. First of all, it was inevitable that there would be conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. If something is inevitable, what does that mean? Bound to happen. It can't not happen in perfect double negative language right there. It was inevitable. This has been building. Who is Jesus's primary, to use a sports term, primary rival throughout his entire teaching? It was the Pharisees. On almost every turn, the Pharisees are who are going against Jesus. And so it was inevitable. It's already started to happen, but it was inevitable that there would be conflict there. Early in his ministry, Jesus was, Mark 3 and verse 5 says, grieved for the hardness of their hearts. What does it mean to have a hardened heart? Nothing good gets in. You're sort of locked into whatever that is. And so we'll see here as we go that Jesus certainly would have opened the door to any Pharisee who wanted to follow him. But it seems like that there was very little interest in doing that. We do see some occasional times when people will migrate over. Nicodemus is probably the best example of that we see somebody who was a prominent Jewish leader who comes over to seem to come over to Jesus' side. But for the most part, hardness of heart sort of kept that from happening. We see here in the third bullet point here that Jesus' humble life and teachings were in almost direct opposition to what the Pharisees had done. The Pharisees were very proud. They were very self-righteous. They were followers of the law, but perhaps more so followers of the tradition that tagged along that went with the law, that it in many cases sort of superseded the law as they were teaching it. Jesus' teachings will be aimed, we've said this quite often, at the hearts and minds of the people. If the thoughts of the people are pure, then their actions would be pure also. And we'll see that quite often with the Pharisees, that the Pharisees were not acting in a way that it seemed like the religious leaders should have acted. Because every time Jesus did something, it was almost as if they were trying to keep that from happening. So we're going to go over a couple of things here this evening. We'll read some scriptures as well. Look at the woes, and then we'll go a little bit deeper with them a little bit later. We've said this before, but the Pharisees were the most numerous and they were the most popular sect of the Jews. I feel like I'm repeating some things, but I'm repeating them because I want you to be familiar with them. When Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees, this is not some minor entity, okay? This is not just some random person that's fussing. This is a large, popular group of Jewish leaders, okay? Jesus is not picking a fight or being engaged in a fight with just one random person around the corner. You know, sometimes we hear about that and we say, is this really, do you need to be engaged in this kind of conflict? I remember when I was in school, when you came out of the AUK, when you came out of the cafeteria where we ate, if you went down the bottom steps, there was a man that would stand there and will quote unquote preach every day. But mostly what he did was just yelled at people as they came in. And I just remember thinking, like, there's a lot better ways to handle this than what you're doing. But if you're just going to yell and scream at somebody, if it's just one person, you know, maybe you don't need to deal with this. But Jesus was dealing with a large group of people, which are the Pharisees. As we've seen, Jesus's popularity continues to grow, right? More and more followers. The first time Jesus performs a miracle, there was a handful of people. By the end, he's got multitudes following him to the point that the Pharisees were quite nervous about him. We read this the other night, but they considered him an enemy, and they were figuring out ways that they could try and get rid of Jesus. Now, we're on the third day. We've been on the third day for a couple of weeks now. We said that we're studying the last week of Jesus's life. So we're still on the third day. And what we're going to look at tonight is Jesus's last, let's say, public discussion. Okay? Last public discussion where Jesus is in a open crowd. There's people that are there, and there could be others that could be coming and going here as well. And so Jesus's last public discussion, this is just a few days before the crucifixion is recorded. As you can see here, this antagonism between him and the Pharisees is about to reach a climax. When we say antagonism, when we say antagonize, what do we mean by that? There are people that you may know that would live to antagonize people, okay? That their whole goal is to try and jab you just a little bit to try and get you to sort of argue back. We see a little bit of this with the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees have antagonized Jesus. Every time Jesus does something good, what do the Pharisees do? They try to find fault in it. They drag it down. They say, well, you can't, that person's arm may be healed, but you did it on the Sabbath day and you can't do that. There's this antagonistic streak that's there. How much of that do you think you could take before you were aggravated? Probably not much, right? It's hard for us to be able to handle that. But I think that's a word that works right here. And what Jesus is going to do is Jesus, at the sort of end of this antagonism, is going to say, all right, Pharisees, here's what it is. If you're in Matthew chapter 23, you can flip over. Well, I say flip over, it's in my Bible. But if you go down just a little bit, you'll see, woe to you. Woe to you. Woe to you. Okay? What Jesus is doing here, what we'll see Jesus doing, is he is rebuking the Pharisees. He's going to use some words to describe them. Okay? He's going to describe them as hypocrites. We talked about that the other night, right? A hypocrite is what? Says one thing and does another. You see here, he'll use that word or that description several times in Matthew 23. He'll call them blind guides. What do you think a blind guide? First of all, do you want a blind guide? All right. Imagine Dad's walked the Appalachian Trail, but imagine climbing Mount Everest and the guy that's going to lead you up there is blind. What might happen? It's going to be tough to make it, right? Because I need the person that's guiding me to know which direction they're going. And Jesus refers to them as a blind guide. Essentially, they're the religious leaders. They're pulling people along. They have no idea where they're going. He calls them, again, fools and blind. He'll call them serpents. You're probably familiar with that term that's used in verse 33 right there. The word serpent, what is a serpent, by the way? Snake, all right? How many of you are very anti-snake? Don't like snakes, all right? Occasionally I see snakes, but I don't tell Mary about them, all right? I do not tell Mary about snakes. Why do we have such a negative impression of, why do people, they don't bother me, but why do people not like snakes? Right.
Or you see them scared of it. And you pick up on that.
I think there's probably truth to that. Why else? Well, but I'm saying, like, well, I don't know that that's why people are afraid of snakes, like today, if one slithers through the yard. That feels like a biased account back there. I'm not really sure. Sneaky, slimy, okay? We don't see a lot of animals that move like snakes, right? So it's very different. You know, most animals we see have 4 legs, right? And if it's a deer or if it's a groundhog, they're still moving sort of the same way. But if it's a snake, it's sort of going in a different direction. We don't usually describe someone as a snake in a positive light, right? How many of you have ever heard somebody who maybe's cheated people out of something, or, you know, maybe they've lied and you've called them a snake? You ever heard somebody say that? It's not a term of endearment. Lucille? A snake in the grass. These are not positive comments about people. Well, Jesus will refer to the scribes and the Pharisees as serpents. And then a little later in the same verse, a generation or a brood of vipers. So they're not just one, but a whole mess of them right there as well. These are not positive comments that we're going to see Jesus make. These are not descriptors where you could say, oh, I can't really tell if he likes them or not. Okay? This is going to be pretty straightforward, not really liking what they did. Now, we'll see here that Jesus will rebuke the Pharisees, okay? And so these condemnations are just about as high as you can get. You really can't fuss any more than what Jesus is going to fuss right here. These condemnations, these rebukes of the Pharisees. And what he's doing is he's exposing their hypocrisy. And typically, if someone is being hypocritical, and I would fall into this category at times, I've been hypocritical about things as well. And when that's exposed, how does that make you feel? Pretty low, right? It makes you feel, because you think, okay, I've messed up. I've done wrong. And usually when we've messed up or we've done wrong, we tend to do what to the person that's exposed it? Kind of want to bite back sometimes. We want to defend ourselves maybe in this case. And so when Jesus will call these Pharisees, when he will say that they've been hypocritical, when he will say that their life that they're living is not a good life, that they are not teaching the people the way they should teach, that's not going to go over real well with them. Now, at any time, could any of these Pharisees who have been in the wrong regarding Jesus, could at any time, could they have followed Jesus? Certainly. Some did. So they absolutely could. So this is not something, and I want us to be careful about this when we read this. This is Jesus being very critical of the scribes and the Pharisees. But this is not Jesus shutting a door or closing a curtain and saying, you are forever on the other side. I have 3 kids in my 5th period class that has just started last week, because we got new classes last week. And I will say there's 27 kids in the class, but there's 3 that are a problem, all right? And so on Monday, I kept one of them after class, and we sat for about 5 minutes and talked. And today I kept the second one after class, and we sat for about 5 minutes and talked as well. The first one the other day was kind of like, yeah, I realize I've done wrong. The second one didn't really agree that was being called back. And he said, well, you didn't call. He mentioned the third kid's name. And I said, I'm not talking to him yet. I said, okay, I'm going to talk with him tomorrow. So I'm not going to have all three of you in here because then you're going to play off each other. But when I called him in, what I was doing was I was telling him, you are not acting in a way that's acceptable. Know that his mom and his dad wouldn't like that either. He doesn't want me to call his mom and dad, and I don't want to have to call his mom and dad either. But I told him, I said, you were in a different class 2 weeks ago, and you acted totally different. But now that you are with these two others, you have totally changed. Now, which one are you right there? Jesus is seeing these Pharisees, and he's saying, you are acting like serpents and vipers and hypocrites or whatever. But is there a chance for them to make a change? Certainly. How many times do we act like the hypocrites and the vipers and the snakes? We all do, right? But is it possible for us to change? Is it good that we have that ability to change? But will that kid in my class, if he comes tomorrow and acts the same way that he did today, is that a change? No. So he's got to take that upon himself, just like we have to make changes in our life, so too did the Pharisees as well. Jesus will therefore leave them in the temple, and their house was left desolate, and destruction of the temple would be inevitable. All right. A little bit of a preview for us there. Thoughts on anything before we get into our read Matthew 23? Yes. Yeah. It's hard to forget. If you didn't hear Melvina what she said, that it's wonderful that when we make those changes, when we fix ourselves, when we change, Jesus doesn't hold that against us, right? We do, right? Sometimes we hold it against ourselves, or we definitely hold it against the other person. Like, well, I heard he's going to church, but he's mean to me, right? We will tend to hold that against people. And that's a problem that we have to fix in ourselves as well. Yes, sir. Yes. Sure. You should be the example for the people. Other thoughts on what we're about to say? I know we've not got into it yet. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Don's about a week ahead, but when we get to the end of chapter 23, I think everyone will, no, you're fine. Everyone will know where Jesus stands on this issue. There will be no debating, what do you think? What do you mean right there? And I think you're exactly right on that. Let's go to Matthew 23. We got a couple things we're going to read here. We're going to read through verse 12. I've broken them down into a few different verses here to start with. So this is Matthew 23, verses 1 through 4. Will, do you care to read this for us, sir? Okay, let's go a little further. By the way, I didn't put it in red because all the words would have been read on this. So really, outside of that first sentence, it's all Jesus speaking. Matthew 23, 5 to 7. Mary, do you care to read that? Tom, you could have finished verses 8 to 12, sir. Now, I want you to stay in your Bible, verses 1 through 12, because I'm going to be asking questions. We're going to be talking about this, but the scripture is going to go off the screen here, so I want you to be able to access it whenever we discuss this. All right, so let's talk about the first thing right here. Those first 3 verses. Jesus told his listeners to do all the scribes and Pharisees said, but not to do their works. What's the reason behind what Jesus says here? So Jesus is in a sense saying, do as they say, but what? Not as they do, right? That's a thing that we sometimes learn from an early age, right? Do as I say, sometimes, but not as I do. What Jesus is saying to them is, they're going to tell you everything that's in the scriptures. They're going to tell you everything that's right. But what are they going to do? They're going to do the direct opposite. So if you know what they teach, if you read in the scriptures what they teach, but then you do what they do, are you going to be in the right or in the wrong? You're going to be in the wrong right there. So it's not a matter of knowledge, but it's a matter of action. Can that be an issue with people even today? Of course. We can know what to do when it comes to scriptures, when it comes to the Bible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to do it. Okay? We can know, but it doesn't necessarily mean. So Jesus' reasoning here was that they are telling you what to do, but they are not doing what they should. If they were, they wouldn't be treating Jesus the way that they were. Now, I do want to say this. If the heart was in the right place, and we've talked about this before, some of the questions that the Pharisees asked of Jesus were legitimate questions. I think it's a legitimate question to ask, can you heal on the Sabbath day? But they didn't accept the answer that was presented to them, right? When Jesus would answer those questions, quite often they were not trying to really get an answer, but rather they were trying what? Trying to trap him in the answer that he gave. These are legitimate questions, but the approach or the angle that they were being asked were not legitimate. Jesus said, the Pharisees bind heavy burden on men's shoulders, but do not move them with their fingers. They do all their works to be seen by men. We'll get to the questions in a second, but I want you to look at that second bullet point. They bind heavy burdens on men's shoulders, but do not move them with their fingers. Tell me what that means. Right.
Nothing in the Bible about it. Scripture teaches the opposite.
Right.
So we have a tendency to want to bind our opinions.
Yeah.
And our thoughts on everyone. That's what the Pharisees did.
Sure.
Even though they had no authority.
Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
Really hypocritical as they were to know what's right. Tell people to turn around and do it.
Right. Other thoughts? Yes, ma'am. I think you may be right. Yeah, I think we can see that happening quite a bit throughout this. Dad, I want to say something that borrows on something that I know you've done. We talked about hiking the Appalachian Trail. And Dad has said that you tried your pack to be like 35 pounds. It was give or take, something like that. It was kind of what the backpack was. But Dad has said, and I can't relate to this because I haven't done it, but he said if you put one sucker in the backpack, you could feel it because you knew what 35 pounds felt like, and anything more in there, you felt it. Well, those burdens that were being placed on these people, you got to do this, you got to do this. Do you think they felt it? They absolutely was. Now, what if Dad was carrying 35 pounds on his back and I had a sucker and I said, I don't think I want this. And I put it in his backpack, but I don't carry a backpack at all. Is that fair? What should I do in the case of him 35 pounds plus a sucker? I ought to carry 17 and a half of that, right? Or maybe even 20 if I can help out in some way. And I think what Ben was saying right there is they're throwing all this other stuff, but they're not doing any extra work. It's falling on the people. Absolutely. At the end of this verse, it said they make broad their blank and they enlarge the borders of their blank. These may be a couple of words that you may not be familiar with. The old King James may be different than the new King James. So we'll see what you have. But in verse 5, but all their works they do to be seen by men, they make their what broad? Does it say phylacteries? All right. Is it old King James says P-H-Y-L? Is that right? We'll see what that is here in a second. And then prayer, yours is a lot more easier to pronounce. We'll see it in just a second. And they enlarge the borders of their what? Garments. All right, let's talk for a minute. Okay, I got some pictures for you to look at. Some of you may be familiar with this. Some of you may not be familiar with this. These are phylacteries. Okay, these are phylacteries. You can see here that this is a person's arms, their left arm here. They have this strap that goes around. We'll see a better picture here in a second. But I want you to look at this right here. It's like a little box, okay? So it's like a little box. This is it blown up, okay? So it's a larger version. They have something similar here. This is the back of the guy's head. This is the front. You can see it's sort of wrapped around his head. There's also this same little box like this right there, okay? Kind of ties around the back and it droops down on his neck. Now, when Jesus says that they enlarge their phylacteries, this is what we're talking about. At morning prayer, phylacteries, which are called tefillin in Hebrew, are worn by observant Jewish men each weekday morning during prayer. So this is not a wear it all the time, but you wore it during prayer. 2 small leather boxes contain verses from the first books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Torah. They contain verses from the Bible. Boxes are then attached to leather straps, okay? So this is a box. You got little verses put inside of it, and you've got one on your arm, you've got one on your head. These straps are what's used to sort of keep it tied on, okay? Now, it's very much a cultural thing. It's something that still exists, but there's something that was done by Jewish people. This is what Jesus was talking about right here. They are worn as a reminder of God and to follow Jewish law daily. Obviously, if you strap something like this around your arm or around your head, you'll notice it, right? And so the idea is that when I notice this on my arm, oh, I know what I've got with me. All right, I've got the scripture with me. Okay? Now, this is, again, cultural. You're not Jewish, so it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. There's nothing wrong with any of this. This was what they did culturally. But what Jesus said that they did was they were taking these boxes and they were enlarging them. Now, why would someone do that? Draw attention. Because if every one of us had the exact same thing, it really wouldn't be that noticeable, right? Now, if one person was standing here wearing that, you'd notice it. But if we all had the same thing, and let's say that all of us had a box that was, I don't know, the size this big, okay? But then I have a box that's this big. What are you going to notice when you walk by me? Ooh. All right. Now, if we doubled the size of the box, what else could I put in there? I could put more scriptures, okay? You've only got 2. I have 4. That makes me twice as what? Now, I'm stretching that just a little bit, but bear with me. What we see there is sometimes we sort of conflate or inflate ourselves a little bit right there. And that's what Jesus is saying. Are you really that much more better? Or are you just enlarging the phylactery to make yourself seen? Okay? Because nobody's going to come up and say, Ben, open that so I can see what all you got in there. But I'm just going to assume if it's that big, you probably got a whole book of Deuteronomy in there somewhere. So the point of this is to show Jesus is saying to them, you're being hypocritical right here. You are enlarging this phylactery here. You're making yourself look better in the crowd. Yes, sir. Yeah. Right. Right. Sure. Sure. And then again, literally not a single thing wrong with it. You could do this today if you wanted to. People would probably look at you a little odd because it's not a culturally accepted thing that most of us do. But this was something that was designed to sort of, right here. Yeah, could be. I think so. We read in Matthew 23, verses 6 and 7. Yeah. I should have probably looked that up. I didn't really look. I think that we talked about that in when we talked about in some of the Old Testament lessons, how that they had the trimmings on the side. I think it's a modification of things that they were to do. There were 4 things that Jesus said in Matthew 23, 6 and 7. 4 things that these people loved. Okay, the first one. Sorry, my clicker is not clicking. All right, so at the feast, what did they like? All right, they like the best places at the feast. What does that mean? I want the best seat in the house, right? I want the best seat in the house. Will and I were talking about in our parable lessons on Sunday morning back there in the back that Jesus actually said, don't sit in the front, go sit in the back. And he said, because when you go sit up there in the front, you're just drawing attention to yourself. They wanted what in the synagogues? One of the best seats in the synagogue. I want to sit at the front of the feast. And I want in the synagogue, I want to sit right here in the front. And that way, everybody that walks by will what? They will see me and they'll say, how in the world does somebody that cool get to sit right there, right? What about in the marketplace? They want the best greetings in the marketplace. Every single person stop and talk to that guy. He must be important, right? They want to be called what? Rabbi, teacher, father, whatever thing. It says 4 things that they love. There's not a single thing wrong with any of these 4 things. There's nothing wrong with sitting in the front. There's nothing wrong with being given the best seat. But what happens is when you desire this more than anything else. Now, when somebody walks through the marketplace and doesn't greet you, say, hey, Maria. All right. Don't you dare walk by without saying it. All right. You kind of go from, well, it was nice that she, now I'm starting to expect it. And that's what becomes of the Pharisees. It went from, there's nothing wrong with saying hello to the religious leader as you walk by, but don't expect it. Don't mean that you've got to do that by rule or by law. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Sure. Sure. Jesus exhorted the people not to seek religious titles like rabbi, father, or master. We read that in Matthew 23, verses 8 through 10. Because he said, for he who is greatest among you shall be what? All right. And so we see that sort of flip, right? Sometimes when we feel like we're right here, we'll flip around. I told that to students years ago. I said, I'm not going to be mean to you. I might fuss at you, but I'm not going to be mean to you. Because I said, I know several of you are taking nursing classes right now. And I said, there's going to be a day down the line that I'm probably going to be laying in that bed and you're going to be the nurse. And I don't need you coming in here saying, nah, he was meaner than a snake to me in government class, so I'm just going to, But sometimes we might think we're here, but it doesn't take long for us to be where? To be right back down here. He said, the greatest among you will be the servant. Sure. Sure. Right.
And we constantly have to remind them, no, you're there to serve us. We put you there, you're supposed to be serving us. But once you get that power, you will say you do.
That can be the same with your politician, with your union. That can be the same with the elders in the church. It absolutely can be. Anybody who has any level of authority, it can go up to here real quick if we're not careful. The last verse that we read, Jesus proclaimed, what will happen to those who exalt themselves and humble themselves? Let's look at the two parts. He said, those who exalt themselves will be what? Will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be what? Exalted. Now, have you ever seen that happen in life? We all can relate to it, right? And Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, this is what's going to happen to you. Because you're spending a whole lot of your life up here, but what's going to happen to those Pharisees? They're going to be humbled right there. They kicked Jesus around a lot, but who's going to be the ultimate winner? He's going to end up being exalted right there. Questions? I think that's where we're going to stop. What? Huh? I don't feel like I can answer that question. So, all right. If I can encourage you to do one thing before next Wednesday night, I would like for you to read Matthew chapter 23, verses 13 through 36. Just 13 through 38. You can read the last 39, I guess. You can read the rest of the chapter. But what you're going to see is Jesus say, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. I want you to read that. You can read it tonight. It won't take you 5 minutes to read. Okay? But I want you to read that. And I want you to think for just a little bit, why is Jesus saying this? Why do you think these are the things that Jesus chose to use a word that we would use to fuss about? Okay? So read the rest of Matthew chapter 23 and consider, why is Jesus saying this to those people? All right? Thank you very much. You're welcome.